Hello, hello, hello. I'm not sure if the street noise was captured. So sorry. Hello. How are you guys? I hope you guys are doing fine. Today or tonight, I am back with another horror scary stories video. Yes. And today I have 4 horror stories. I already read through these stories and I thought they were quite creepy, and I couldn't wait to get this video out. I know I usually don't post 2 horror story videos consecutively, but I was quite excited to get these stories out, so I'm filming another horror story video. So get cozy. I hope you enjoyed the stories, and let's get started. Okay, the first story we have for today is titled The Funeral Home. A few years ago, I took a job working the night shift at a small family-owned funeral home in our town. The pay was decent and the hours suited me just fine. It was usually quiet, just me and the stillness of the night. Occasionally, I would hear the creak of the old wooden floors or the soft hum of the refrigerator, but otherwise it was eerily peaceful. One particular night, I was sitting in the office, catching up on some paperwork. It was around 2 a.m., and the silence was so thick that I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering sound. I paused. Thinking maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the whispering continued, growing slightly louder and more distinct. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the embalming room. My heart started to race as I stood up and slowly made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The whispering grew louder with each step, almost like a conversation between 2 people, but the words were unintelligible. I reached the door to the embalming room and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Gathering my courage, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the stainless steel surfaces. The body of an elderly man who had passed away the previous day lay on the table, covered by a white sheet. The whispering had stopped, and the room was deathly silent. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I had heard. As I turned to leave, I got a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. I I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows playing tricks on me, I told myself. I took a deep breath and walked back to the office, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I sat down at my desk and tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the embalming room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About an hour later, I heard the whispering again. This time it was clearer, almost like someone was standing right outside the office door. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest, and flung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the whispering continued, now coming from the direction of the viewing room. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the hallway, my hands shaking. The viewing room was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. I shone the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the rows of chairs and the casket at the front of the room, waiting for the next day's service. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft sigh, followed by a faint whisper. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I bolted out of the room and back to the office, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I couldn't wait for my shift to end. The next morning, I told my boss about the strange occurrences, but he just laughed it off, saying the old building had a way of playing tricks on people. I wasn't convinced. I put in my notice a few days later and never looked back. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that night. I have heard stories about spirits lingering in places where they met their end, but I never believed them until it happened to me. Now every time I pass by that funeral home, I can't help but wonder if the whispers are still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to hear them. Creepy. When I first read this story, I had goosebumps. I don't know why. Something about funeral homes, it gives me the creeps. Imagine working there in the night. Okay, story number 2 is titled Home Alone. A couple of years ago, I agreed to house sit. House sit? Is that a thing? House sitting? It's new to me. A couple of years ago, I agreed to house sit for a friend who was going on vacation. She lived in a beautiful old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. The house had a lot of character with creaky floorboards, antique furniture, and a general air of history. Despite its charm, I always felt a bit uneasy there, especially at night. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, watching TV, and exploring the nearby trails. But on the fourth night, things started to get strange. It was around midnight, and I was curled up on the couch with a book when I heard a creaking noise upstairs. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then I realized it sounded like footsteps. I put the book down and listened. The creaking continued, moving slowly across the floor above me. I called out, thinking maybe it was my friend's cat, but there was no response. The cat, who had been sleeping next to me on the couch, was now wide awake, staring intently at the ceiling. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs to investigate. The house was dark and eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I checked each room, but there was nothing out of place. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing in the shadows, was a faint outline of a person. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there staring at me with empty eyes. I took a step back, and the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness. I bolted back downstairs, locking myself in the guest room. I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning I packed my bags and left a note for my friend explaining that I had to leave due to an emergency. When my friend returned from her vacation, I told her about the incident. She looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. She assured me that no one had ever reported anything strange happening in the house before. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few weeks later, my friend called me, her voice shaking. She told me that she had started hearing the footsteps too, late at night when the house was quiet. She had even seen the shadowy figure once, standing at the end of the hallway, just like I had described. She moved out soon after, unable to stay in the house any longer. To this day, we still don't know what was haunting that house. Some say it was the spirit of a previous owner who had died there under mysterious circumstances. Others believe it was something darker, something that fed off the fear of those who lived there. All I know is that I will never house it there again, and I always double check my logs before going to bed. Creepy. Story number 3. The Neighbor. When I moved into my new apartment, I was excited to start afresh. The building was old but well maintained. Sorry, the street is exceptionally busy tonight. I'm not sure if it's capturing the sound in the video. If it is, I'm so sorry. Okay, I will start story number 3 again. When I moved into my new apartment, I was excited to start afresh. The building was old but well maintained, and my neighbors seemed friendly enough. There was one neighbor though who I never saw. His apartment was directly across from mine, but the blinds were always drawn and the door was always closed. I asked around and found out that the previous tenant had passed away. A few months was faint and muffled. I so you say it groggily, like groggy. I groggily got out of bed and listened. The crying continued, coming from the direction of the mysterious neighbor's apartment. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to check it out. I grabbed my phone and made my way to the door. As I opened it, the crying stopped, abruptly replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart pounding in my chest, before knocking on the neighbor's door. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I put my ear to the door, listening intently. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a soft whisper, followed by the sound of footsteps moving away from the door. I stepped back, my mind racing. The apartment was supposed to be empty, but it sounded like someone was inside. The next morning, I went to the building manager and asked about the apartment. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. That apartment has been vacant for months, she said. The previous tenant passed away, and we haven't rented it out yet. A chill ran down my spine. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the crying again. This time it was clearer, almost like someone was standing right outside my door. I pulled the covers over my head and waited for it to stop. Eventually it did, but the experience left me shaken. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences continued. I would hear footsteps in the hallway late at night, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of a shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye. One evening, as I was coming home from work, I saw the door to the neighbor's apartment slightly ajar. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark and empty, just as the building manager had said, but there was a cold, oppressive feeling in the air, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I quickly shut the door and hurried back to my own apartment, my heart racing. One night, as I was laying in bed, I felt a sudden chill. I opened my eyes and saw the shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure slowly reached out a hand towards me, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away. When I finally opened them, the figure was gone, but the room still felt icy cold. The next day, I decided to do some research on the building and its history. I spent hours at the local library, sifting through old newspapers and records. I discovered that the previous tenant of the apartment across from mine had been an elderly man who lived alone. He was known to be a bit of a loner, and his death had gone unnoticed for several days. Neighbors have reported hearing strange noises coming from his apartment, but no one thought much of it until the smell became unbearable. There were also reports of other mysterious deaths in the building over the years. A Each death was surrounded by rumors and whispers of something sinister lurking in the building. I then reached out to a friend who is also a paranormal investigator. I explained the strange occurrences and the history of the building. He agreed to come over and check it out. When he arrived, he set up various devices and cameras around the apartment and the hallway. As night fell, we sat in my living room watching the monitors. For the first few hours, nothing happened. But then around midnight, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped and we heard the faint sound of crying again. My friend's equipment started picking up unusual readings, and one of the cameras in the hallway captured a shadowy figure moving towards my door. We both jumped up and ran to the hallway, but it was empty. My friend played back the footage, and sure enough, there was the shadowy figure, slowly making its way towards my apartment. He decided to do a spirit box session. What is a spirit box session? He decided to do a spirit box session, hoping to communicate with whatever was haunting the building. As he asked questions, the spirit box crackled with static. Suddenly a voice came through, faint but clear. "Help me," it said. We both stared at each other wide-eyed. He continued to ask questions, and the voice responded intermittently. It mentioned the name John, which we later confirmed was the name of the elderly man who had died in the apartment across mine. The voice also mentioned trapped, leading us to believe that the spirit was not at peace and possibly trapped in the building. My friend performed a cleansing ritual, hoping to help the spirit move on. After the ritual, the atmosphere in the building felt lighter, and the strange occurrence seemed to stop. I still live in the same apartment, but the sense of dread that used to hang over the building has lifted. I occasionally hear the faint sound of crying, but it's much less frequent and I no longer see the shadowy figure. I hope that John's spirit has found peace and that the other spirits in the building have moved on as well. The experience left me with a newfound respect for the paranormal. While I can't explain everything that happened, I know what I saw and heard. The building may look normal from the outside, but it holds secrets and stories that will forever remain a part of its history. It's quite a long story, and a very brave person. If it were me in this incident, I would have left the apartment the very next day, maybe the very night. Okay. Final story. Let me see. Okay, here. The midnight cab driver. For as long as I can remember, I have worked the midnight shift as a cab driver. The city takes on a different personality after dark. The streets are quieter, the lights dimmer, and the air carries an eerie silence. I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things during my time on the job, but one night stands out above the rest. It was a chilly autumn night, and the streets were unusually empty. I had been driving around for hours, picking up the occasional passenger, but mostly cruising in the stillness. Around 3 a.m., I received a call from dispatch about a fair in an old part of town, known for its rundown buildings and narrow, winding streets. I drove to the pickup location, an old house that looked like it hadn't been occupied for years. The windows were dark and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I parked out front and waited, glancing at the rear view mirror to see if anyone was coming out. After a few minutes, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows of the house. It was a woman in a long dark coat, her face obscured by a hood. She moved slowly, almost gliding, as she made her way to the car. I unlocked the doors and she slipped into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, looking at her through the rear-view mirror. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and she seemed to be staring straight through me. Take me to the old graveyard," she replied in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, but then I nodded and started the car. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but she remained silent, staring out the window with a distant, almost haunted look in her eyes. The streets grew narrower and darker as we approached the graveyard, the trees casting long shadows across the road. We finally arrived at the graveyard, an old forgotten place surrounded by an iron fence. I stopped the car and turned to tell her we had arrived, but she was already gone. The back seat was empty and the door was slightly ajar. I stepped out of the cab, confused and a little unnerved. I looked around but saw no sign of her. The graveyard gates were closed and locked, and the place looked deserted. I walked to the back of the car, hoping to find some clue, but there was nothing. Just as I was about to get back in the car, I noticed something strange. The ground near the gate looked disturbed, like someone had recently dug there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed over the fence, making my way to the disturbed ground. As I got closer, I saw a small, freshly dug grave with a simple headstone. The name on the headstone made my blood run cold. Evelyn Hunt, 1923 to 1948. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Evelyn Hunt had been dead for over 70 years. The woman I had picked up couldn't have been her. I hurried back to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I started the engine and sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just experienced something beyond explanation. The next day, I did some research and found an old newspaper article about Evelyn. She had died under mysterious circumstances. Her body found near the very graveyard where I had dropped her off. The case had never been solved, and her death had become one of the city's many unsolved mysteries. I still drive the midnight shift, but I will never forget that night. Sometimes when I'm driving through that part of town, I think I catch a glimpse of a figure in a dark coat out of the corner of my Some things are best left forgotten. Creepy. I found these stories very creepy, to be honest. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the stories. I found them to be really creepy. That's why I was excited to get these stories out. It's funny how horror stories or whispered horror stories can be relaxing at the same time. For me at least, so I'm pretty sure there are people who share similar sentiments. If you have experienced paranormal experiences, or you have some such stories to share, I'll be very glad if you can send them to me, because I love reading horror stories, and I'll be happy to read out the stories in another video as well. So yeah, until next time, I'll catch you again in a new video. Take care and hasta luego. Bye bye.